Good evening. I'm Professor Sleepington, your guide through the least thrilling lives ever lived. Tonight's subject? Oh, it's a biography so profoundly uneventful, so magnificently monotonous, it might just cure your insomnia for good. Picture, if you will, the soft rustle of parchment maps, the scent of gunpowder long since gone cold, and the rhythmic tap of a general's boot, pausing only for dramatic effect. No, this is not a story of war and glory. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, told so slowly and so dryly that you may at some point forget whether he was real or a very persistent fever dream from your old history textbook. Forget excitement. This story unfolds so slowly you'll feel like you're aging with it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and check if you are subscribed to the channel, because several viewers of the channel are complaining that YouTube is removing their subscriptions, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a comment with your location and local time. It always amuses me to know which corners of the world are falling asleep to tales of ambition and slightly damp exile. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin tonight's sleepy descent into mediocrity. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15th, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica, a location that sounds exotic until you realize it mostly consists of rocks, goats, and the occasional thunderstorm. His mother, Letizia, had the good sense to deliver him in a modest home that still exists, perhaps out of historical guilt. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a local lawyer with aspirations bigger than his budget and a mustache that seemed to demand more respect than it ever received. The infant Napoleon, small and slightly squinty, did not cry any more loudly than necessary. Local legend claims the wind carried his first breath across the Mediterranean like a whisper of impending inconvenience. Historians still argue whether his peculiar silence was a sign of stoicism or indigestion. Corsica had just been sold to France by Genoa, which meant Napoleon's nationality shifted before he even learned to walk. He would grow up technically French, but culturally Corsican, which is a bit like being raised in a room where everyone speaks French, but with knives. This dual identity would leave him both isolated and irritable, a state that, to be fair, he would maintain throughout adulthood. As a child, Napoleon was neither particularly sociable nor particularly tall. He enjoyed solitude, preferred books to people, and found delight in things like Roman history, swordplay, and quiet brooding. Letizia, ever the firm mother, had high hopes that her little Napoleon would either make something of himself, or at the very least stop sword fighting in the parlor. By the age of 9, Napoleon was shipped off to mainland France to begin military schooling. This was partly because of his talent, and partly because Corsican homes had only so much furniture that could be damaged by sabers. He arrived speaking heavily accented French, which immediately made him a target for mockery by boys with better enunciation but fewer ambitions. He spent those early years at Brienne-le-Château, a military academy located in a chilly part of northeastern France, where the damp air encouraged both contemplation and respiratory illness. It was here that Napoleon learned how to be alone in a crowd, an early skill that would prove useful on windswept Russian plains and cold exile islands. He also became adept at mathematics, particularly geometry and artillery calculations. His peers noted his moodiness, quick temper, and tendency to dominate group assignments, even when he clearly hadn't read the instructions. His teachers, meanwhile, described him as serious, proud, and inclined to sarcasm, which, coincidentally, is how I describe myself in most social situations. In terms of personality, he was already practicing the subtle art of command, standing slightly apart from the group, furrowing his brow with intensity, and giving orders that sounded both reasonable and slightly threatening. He was the kind of child who would assign seating arrangements at lunch and then issue mild punishments for noncompliance. Still, for all his ambition, the young Napoleon was not exactly the picture of charisma. His social life was best described as limited, and his posture, stiff, deliberate, made him look like he was constantly preparing for a statue to be made. A curious quirk, considering how many statues would eventually follow. Interestingly, there are accounts from his youth claiming he once punched a fellow student for mispronouncing Ajaccio. Historians still argue whether this was a passionate defense of homeland pride or just the result of too little sleep and too many cabbage dinners. As Napoleon completed his schooling and received his commission as a second lieutenant, no one, not even his instructors, guessed that this short, awkward Corsican boy would one day crown himself emperor. Most assumed he would become a moderately competent artillery officer and perhaps retire early to write confusing treatises on military strategy. The world had other plans, and so did he. He left Brienne with little fanfare, clutching a modest diploma, a stack of notebooks, and a personality so intense it could curdle milk. His journey had begun, though it would take years, several dusty battlefields, dozens of promoted enemies, and far too many self-portraits before the name Napoleon Bonaparte meant anything more than the quiet one with the glare. And yet, even then, the first domino had been nudged, slowly, reluctantly, and with as much subtlety as a cannonball at rest. After being gently ejected from his childhood on Corsica, Napoleon arrived at Brienne-le-Château, France's idea of a military academy for ambitious boys, and, incidentally, a place where personality went to nap. The school itself was nestled in the northeastern region of Champagne, though the curriculum, sadly, did not include actual champagne. Instead, students were offered a steady diet of drill formations, Latin grammar, and character-building discomfort. It was 1779, and Napoleon was 10 years old, carrying a Corsican accent so thick it could be mistaken for a regional cheese. His peers, mostly aristocratic and overly powdered, took swift notice of this. Within days, they had begun calling him the Little Corporal, not as a compliment, but as the kind of nickname that says, "We will remember your name when you've done something mildly annoying." Napoleon responded with his signature social strategy, ignoring everyone and excelling academically just enough to make it worse. He focused his energy on mathematics, especially geometry and artillery theory, which, to him, was just geometry with louder consequences, while other boys fumbled through fencing drills and flirted awkwardly with local girls. Napoleon plotted hypotheticals involving battalion formations and how to best angle a cannonball for maximum irony. His instructors observed a young man who was quiet, intense, and deeply uninterested in small talk. He was often seen pacing alone on the school grounds, speaking softly to himself in Corsican, either rehearsing military speeches or practicing how best to glare at people who didn't know where Corsica was. He also wrote essays, lengthy, melodramatic essays, often about how deeply he missed his island home or how the French had robbed Corsica of its soul. These compositions earned him decent marks and the concern of at least one school official, who wondered aloud whether the boy needed a hobby less existential. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's time at Brienne shaped his genius or merely gave him a prolonged opportunity to perfect the art of cold shouldering an entire peer group. What is known is that he was gifted in mathematics, hopeless in Latin, and emotionally allergic to losing even a simple board game. One anecdote, possibly apocryphal, but too charming to exclude, describes Napoleon flipping a game table in a rage after losing at chess to a boy named Etienne. Apparently, Etienne had taken his rook with a bishop, and Napoleon considered this not only unfair, but deeply offensive to all military logic. He refused to speak to Etienne for 6 weeks, despite sharing a dormitory and a lunch schedule. Outside the classroom, he was noticeably solitary. He did not join the popular boys in playing harpsichord duets or reenacting scenes from Molière. Instead, he spent hours reading Plutarch's Lives, occasionally muttering things like Brutus was right under his breath. On a good day, he might write a poem about lost empires or draw battle plans in the margins of his grammar workbook. On a bad day, he just glared at the ceiling and sighed audibly. Despite his antisocial tendencies, Napoleon's academic performance was sufficient to earn him a transfer to the École Militaire in Paris, the kind of upgrade one gets not through charm but through sheer numbers on a math exam. At 16, he packed his sparse belongings and marched, figuratively and literally, toward a future he believed would be grander, colder, and more organized. Before leaving Brienne, however, he reportedly left a note pinned to his dormitory wall that read, "They will regret underestimating me." This statement, if true, reflects either deep-seated confidence or the early signs of what would become a decades-long commitment to dramatic flair. Scholars remain divided. At the École Militaire, things became simultaneously more serious and more French. The students were wealthier, the uniforms stiffer, and the disdain more elegantly pronounced. Napoleon, short on funds and even shorter on tolerance for nonsense, doubled down on his studies. He read everything from Caesar's commentaries to Voltaire, though he skipped the Romantic poets, reportedly claiming, "I've no use for pretty sadness." His instructors noticed he had an unusually practical mind. He could memorize battlefield distances, calculate projectile velocity, and organize equipment storage in alphabetical order. He was less interested in etiquette, though. Once declining an invitation to a formal dance with the words, Why would I waste evening hours on silk shoes when war does not waltz? A peculiar highlight of his time in Paris involved a demonstration of artillery positioning, in which Napoleon corrected his instructor mid-lecture, accurately, of course, leading to a brief standoff that ended only when the instructor muttered something about future headaches. Though his time at the École Militaire was cut short by budget constraints, his father had recently died, and the Bonaparte family was suddenly short on wine and tuition. Napoleon managed to graduate in a mere 1 year instead of 2, an acceleration that impressed administrators but gave his classmates even fewer chances to befriend him. When he finally received his commission as a second lieutenant in the artillery, Napoleon was 17 years old, financially strained, and already emitting the faint scent of military destiny and cologne purchased on discount. He was assigned to a regiment at Valence, a sleepy post with little excitement and even less room for ambition. There, Napoleon wrote long letters to his brother Joseph, complaining about the furniture, the food, and the utter mediocrity of his commanding officer's mustache. He also began writing short philosophical essays, one of which tackled the theme, "Is happiness possible for man?" His answer, "Not unless he commands the entire continent." A bit on the nose, perhaps. One particularly odd note from this period involves his brief obsession with potatoes. Napoleon, convinced they were an underrated food of the future, tried to draft a treatise on their nutritional value and military utility. The project was never finished, possibly because he got distracted by actual cannon drills, or because someone told him potatoes already existed in the army kitchens, and thus the sulky student transformed into the sulky soldier, a lieutenant with dreams far beyond his pay grade, armed with mathematics, mild bitterness, and an ever-growing collection of strategic grudges. Napoleon Bonaparte, freshly pressed into the underwhelming uniform of a second lieutenant, arrived at his post in Valence in 1785, a sleepy town with aspirations of boredom. The regiment to which he was assigned specialized in drills, paperwork, and looking busy without doing much of anything. It was the perfect environment for a young man destined to change the world, albeit slowly and with frequent complaints about soup. Life as a junior officer was predictably uneventful. Napoleon spent most of his days supervising the storage of gunpowder and the alignment of cannons that no one had any intention of firing. His evenings were filled with sullen walks, mediocre dinners, and letters to his brother Joseph, filled with laments about the shocking absence of ambition in southern France. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's time in Valence was essential to his development, or merely a prolonged episode of brooding in uniform. Either way, he began to develop an abiding sense that France, indeed the world, was doing everything far too slowly and with far too little flair. He would fix this later. For now, he was stuck calculating firing angles for theoretical battles. That would never come. He briefly attempted to join polite society, attending local salons, where people discussed Rousseau and played harpsichords with unearned confidence. Napoleon stood out, not for his charm or wit, but for the way he stood silently in corners muttering about Corsica and the inefficiency of imperial bureaucracy. One hostess reportedly described him as a strange, rigid boy who speaks as if he's already in charge of something. And yet, there were hints, tiny, barely perceptible ripples, that Napoleon might not remain anonymous forever. While most officers treated their commissions as social positions with a side of marching, Napoleon viewed artillery as a divine calling. He revised firing manuals for fun. He studied the mathematics of explosive force as if the very future depended on how far a cannonball could bounce. During this period, Napoleon also dabbled in writing. Among his earliest and most unpublishable works was a romantic novella titled Clisson et Eugénie, in which the main character, coincidentally a misunderstood soldier, falls in love with a virtuous woman and dies tragically. The prose was overwrought, the dialogue wooden, and the subtext clear. The author was deeply in love with being misunderstood. It's important to note that while Napoleon's military ambitions simmered quietly, France was beginning to boil. The year was 1789, and the French Revolution was kicking into gear. Heads were rolling, quite literally, and people who used to be aristocrats were suddenly discovering how pointy justice could be. Napoleon, ever the observer, watched the chaos unfold with a blend of fascination and calculation. He was still a minor officer, far removed from Parisian politics, but he could sense opportunity wafting through the air. Alongside the smell of unwashed revolutionaries and burning pamphlets, he made his feelings known in essays and private letters, most of which were never published, but remain preserved like pressed flowers of ambition. In one, he described the fall of the Bastille as inevitable, regrettable, and possibly useful. In another, he suggested that France needed a firm hand, possibly attached to a Corsican arm. His own revolutionary moment came in 1793 during the siege of Toulon, a port city where royalists had thrown a royalist tantrum and allowed the British to dock their ships. The French government, desperate to appear competent, sent a muddled group of generals to retake the city. Among the cluttered ranks of officers was Napoleon, now a captain with a mild case of self-importance and a severe addiction to battlefield diagrams. It was here that Napoleon's obsession with artillery found its stage. He surveyed the terrain, identified key high ground, and arranged for cannons to be positioned where they would cause the most inconvenience to the British. His plan was daring, simple, and, most importantly, loud. When executed, the plan worked so well that generals assumed it must have been their idea. But word got around. Reports described a young Corsican officer who displayed unusual clarity and confidence. It wasn't long before Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24, officially entering the fast track of military success, a track he had been drawing for himself since childhood. Historians debate whether it was the strategy itself or Napoleon's tireless self-promotion afterward that truly launched his rise. The truth is probably both. After Toulon, he wrote letters, commissioned reports, and had paintings made in which he appeared either taller or more mysterious than usual. One sketch even showed him silhouetted against the flames of battle, although he had actually been sitting behind a barrel at the time, eating stale bread and calculating trajectory angles. Back in Paris, revolutionary leaders began to take notice. Among them was Paul Barras, a man who excelled at political ambiguity and wearing sashes. Barras saw in Napoleon not just a capable general, but a convenient weapon, young, ambitious, and utterly devoted to the idea that chaos could be organized into conquest. Napoleon was not universally admired. Some called him arrogant. Others said he spoke in cryptic half sentences like, "Order will come," or "The people are tired of leaders without maps." Yet no one could deny that wherever he appeared, things happened, often involving loud noises, strategic diagrams, and the sudden displacement of inconvenient enemies. Around this time, he also briefly dated Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow with powerful friends and a complete lack of interest in military manuals. Their courtship was awkward and slightly theatrical. He sent her long, poetic letters filled with clumsy metaphors. She replied with cautious affection and occasional confusion about what exactly he was saying. As the revolution evolved into the Directory, a government famous for indecision and pastel sashes, Napoleon hovered near the edges, waiting. He wasn't. Yet, the emperor, he wasn't even the most important general. But he had cannons, he had confidence, and most critically, he had time. And so the lieutenant who once counted gunpowder barrels in valence now counted the days until opportunity knocked with sufficient volume. When it did, he would be ready, with a map, a plan, and a speech already written in his head. The year was 1793, and France was in one of its recurring states of political combustion. Heads were rolling, generals were reshuffling like poorly organized playing cards, and the British Navy, ever punctual, had parked itself rather comfortably at the strategic port of Toulon. To everyone's mild irritation, local royalists had handed the port over as if they were gifting a fruit basket to their favorite constitutional monarch. Into this frothy mess wandered Napoleon Bonaparte, still short, still intense, and now, somehow, a captain of artillery with opinions louder than the cannons he so adored. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, let us remember, Toulon was not glamorous. It was damp, confusing, and filled with indecisive revolutionary generals. Command was divided among so many committees and subcommittees that battles were often delayed because no one could agree on where lunch should be served. Napoleon, uninvited but characteristically present, spent most of his time stomping around the city outskirts with maps under his arm, muttering about trajectories and idiots who didn't understand elevation. He sketched diagrams in the dirt, rearranged artillery placements with the enthusiasm of a child reorganizing toy soldiers, and declared with supreme boredom, "We must take the forts." Historians still argue whether his suggestions were welcomed or simply tolerated because no one else wanted to climb up a hill and measure distances by hand. Either way, he began repositioning the artillery, dragging cannons up steep slopes, setting up batteries where they had no business being, and insisting that geometry would win the day. For a man who barely slept, he was incredibly persuasive. At this point, let us introduce a fringe tidbit. One of the batteries he established was nicknamed La Batterie des Hommes Sans Peur, the battery of the men without fear. Naturally, Napoleon stationed himself there regularly because he feared nothing except perhaps social events without a tactical objective. The British, realizing that someone downstairs had finally brought a compass and a plan, grew increasingly concerned. Meanwhile, French command hesitated. Should they attack? Should they wait? Should they host another committee meeting to discuss the shape of future meetings? Napoleon, predictably, did not wait. He launched a series of carefully timed assaults on key positions surrounding Toulon. The main event, however, was the capture of a fort known as Les Guillettes, a high ground that allowed for a generous view of British ships and an even more generous bombardment. The moment this position was taken, Napoleon's cannons rained down projectiles with a sort of cheerless regularity that only true enthusiasts can maintain. The British realized their tea and ships were no longer safe and began the deeply unceremonious process of retreat. One might think that such a successful campaign would be cause for celebration, perhaps even a smile from the famously sullen Corsican. Alas, Napoleon simply scribbled a report, underlined the word victory once or twice, and mailed it to Paris with the enthusiasm of a man posting a late utility bill. Paris responded more energetically. Within days, he was promoted to brigadier general, a swift leap for a man who had, only recently, been in charge of inspecting cannon wheels for wobble, and thus began the second phase of Napoleon's ascent, the myth-making. He commissioned a series of flattering reports describing the siege in terms usually reserved for epic poetry. His involvement was subtly exaggerated. Where he had pointed and directed, he was now said to have personally led charges. Where he had studied terrain from a safe distance, he was now depicted amid the smoke, unmoved by chaos. In one illustration, he appears heroic atop a horse, though no horse was ever recorded as surviving long in his vicinity without complaint. Back in Paris, the Jacobins were busy guillotining at an impressive clip, but word of the young general's efficiency began to spread. They appreciated competence, particularly when it resulted in fewer British ships floating off the coast. Still, for all his strategic success, Napoleon remained a man of strange habits and uncertain friendships. He wrote cryptic diary entries about destiny, stared too long at maps, and refused to attend parties where there wasn't at least one political debate. When asked about his ambitions, he famously replied, "I go where the cannonballs fall," which, while dramatic, made him unpopular at dinner. Meanwhile, the rest of France teetered. The monarchy was no more. The republic barely held together, and power vacuums formed and collapsed like bad soufflés. In this deliciously chaotic environment, a young man with a strict bedtime, a powerful stare, and an unhealthy obsession with artillery could, hypothetically, go very far. And he would. But for now, Napoleon walked the scorched ground outside Toulon one last time, taking in the remains of a port city that had, for a brief moment, allowed him to test his theories, shout at soldiers, and move pieces across a human chessboard. He filed his reports, burned a few bridges, metaphorically, and returned to Paris with the quiet confidence of someone who had just upstaged half the French military without changing expression. Historians still debate what exactly made Toulon the turning point? Was it the brilliance of the assault, the strategic placement of artillery, or was it simply the right young man showing up at the right collapsing empire? Some argue that it was luck. Others believe it was genius. But perhaps the truth is more boring than anyone wants to admit. Napoleon knew how to do math, and no one else had remembered to bring a ruler. After the soft thud of cannon fire had faded over Toulon, and Napoleon's dispatches had been sufficiently embellished to read like military gospel, one might have expected our young general to enjoy a brief moment of rest, perhaps a garden stroll or a tepid bowl of soup. But alas, this is revolutionary France, and leisure is a luxury reserved for people not trying to reinvent warfare while barely 5 feet tall. In 1796, Napoleon was appointed commander of the Army of Italy, which sounds grand until you realize what he was actually handed: a malnourished gaggle of soldiers in ragged uniforms, with shoes more hole than sole and morale lower than a trench in Belgium. The army hadn't been paid in months. Their tents resembled sad laundry lines. Even their gunpowder sighed when used. Napoleon, as always, was undeterred. He arrived, surveyed the scene, and reportedly said something like, "With imagination, we shall win." Historians still argue whether that's inspiring or deeply concerning. Either way, imagination would be cheaper than boots. The campaign began with what could only be described as squelch. Spring rains turned Italian roads into a soupy consistency, somewhere between quicksand and despair. Artillery pieces sank into mud, as if longing to return to the earth. Soldiers slipped, fell, and cursed Napoleon in at least 4 dialects. But in the general's mind, mud was merely a decorative nuisance. His real weapon was maneuver. Rapid, dramatic, impractical maneuver. He treated geography like a puzzle he could solve by flipping the board over. Enemy generals, meanwhile, operated on the comforting assumption that armies moved slowly. Napoleon shattered that expectation with a flurry of movements that made even experienced commanders feel like they were playing chess while he was playing speed checkers. It's worth noting here a fringe tidbit. Napoleon preferred to wear a gray greatcoat and a bicorne hat every day. It made him instantly recognizable to his troops and utterly predictable to artists trying to draw him. By the end of the Italian campaign, over 200 engravings existed of him pointing dramatically at hills, rivers, and slightly confused aides. One by one, he defeated Austrian and Piedmontese forces in a series of battles with names that sound like they were borrowed from obscure cheeses: Montenotte, Lodi, Arcole. In each, he used speed and surprise as a battering ram, splitting enemy lines before breakfast and writing triumphant letters by lunch. At the Battle of Lodi, for example, he charged across a bridge under heavy fire. Whether he personally led the charge or directed it while dramatically posing nearby remains, as usual, a topic of academic bickering. But what truly matters is that afterward, his soldiers started calling him Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal. It was affectionate, possibly patronizing, and stuck like cannon soot to linen. Victory was not just military. Napoleon knew that war without publicity was like cake without frosting, technically complete, But why bother? He sent flowery bulletins back to France describing the courage of his troops, the brilliance of his maneuvers, and the shocking beauty of his jawline. Perhaps implied. Newspapers lapped it up. Artists exaggerated his stature. Paris swooned. Back in Italy, Napoleon governed the conquered territories with the charisma of a caffeinated tax auditor. He reorganized governments, rewrote constitutions, and lectured locals on the benefits of republican virtue, all while requisitioning art, jewelry, and on occasion, entire wagons of marble statuary. One suspects his travel bag became quite heavy. A key historical moment unfolded with the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. Napoleon negotiated it directly with the Austrians, despite technically lacking the authority to do so. But by then, even France had realized that stopping him was harder than just updating the paperwork to match his decisions. And here enters our historians still argue moment. Some claim the Italian campaign revealed Napoleon's genius, his ability to turn chaos into order, mud into momentum. Others say it marked the beginning of his delusions of grandeur, a young man intoxicated by his own headlines. Still others point out that conquering cities while romanticizing Enlightenment ideals is a bit like painting a peace dove on a cannonball. Yet amid all the grandeur, it's worth pausing to remember how thoroughly unglamorous the campaign really was. Marching through Italy meant blistered feet, lice, and more logistical headaches than a wine merchant during rationing. Many of the victories, though real, were messy, muddy, and marked by miscommunication. Napoleon's talent, perhaps, wasn't just strategy, it was packaging. Even as he plotted his next move, he continued sending back ornate descriptions of triumph. The French Directory, those poor bureaucrats in Paris, read his letters with mixed feelings: pride, awe, and the growing suspicion that they had created a political monster who might one day return asking for their chairs. And Napoleon, he was just getting started. For now, he stood somewhere on an Italian hill, arms crossed, squinting dramatically into the middle distance, while a sketch artist fumbled with charcoal. The mud clung to his boots. The smoke hung low on the valley, and the echoes of his legend, still growing, carried faintly through the drizzle, like a half-remembered opera no one could quite hum. By now, dear listener, our sleepy subject had become more than a man with a hat and a fondness for topography. He was becoming, how shall we say it, an idea, a brand, a myth, wrapped in a uniform stitched together with silk, soot, and self-promotion. Yes, we've arrived at the part of our journey where Napoleon Bonaparte, freshly victorious in Italy, discovered the true art of war, marketing. You see, while cannonballs were lovely and cavalry charges dramatic, nothing struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and awe into the minds of Parisians like a well-written bulletin after every skirmish, every soggy maneuver across an Italian field. Napoleon would retreat to his tent, unwrap a quill as though it were a ceremonial dagger, and write. Oh, how he wrote! His reports back to the Directory were triumphs of subtle self-aggrandizement. He praised his soldiers, for following his brilliant orders. He described the enemy as helpless pawns crushed by his foresight. Even the landscape bent to his will, or at least that's how the paragraphs seem to slope. Fringe tidbit: Napoleon once said, "4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets." That's not hyperbole. That's a thesis statement. He knew that perception was ammunition, and he aimed carefully. And so, through ink and flare, he painted himself into the collective imagination of France, not as a general, but as a genius. His bulletins made battles sound like ballets. Mud became marble. Chaos became choreography. If a supply wagon tipped over in a ravine, the report would note a courageous maneuver along a treacherous slope. If 2 horses bolted in panic, it became an inspired flank repositioning. The newspapers back home gobbled it up like leftover brioche. Artists began sketching him with increasingly chiseled features and increasingly implausible horses. Engravings appeared in public squares. Children imitated his posture. Parisians whispered of a Corsican who could bend destiny with a glance. Now, while all this was happening, the Directory, the cautious, cravat-wearing leadership of post-revolutionary France, began to notice something unsettling. Napoleon wasn't just famous. He was popular, alarmingly so, and worse, he was articulate. Historians still argue whether the Directory empowered Napoleon because they admired his brilliance, or simply hoped to keep him far away from Paris until further notice. Possibly both. Either way, they smiled nervously and gave him permission to publish his own newspaper, Le Courrier de l'Armée d'Italie. Yes, he got his own press outlet. Imagine a general today launching a military newsletter that doubles as his personal fan club. That's essentially what happened. Soldiers read it in their camps. Citizens read it in cafes. It was, in effect, the 18th century version of going viral. And if the Directory winced every time he mentioned liberty, destiny, or my will, they didn't say so. Not yet. Let's not forget the visuals. Napoleon commissioned portraits, not just for celebration, but for precision. He wanted to be seen in a very specific way: calm, serious, eternal. One particularly famous painting, by Antoine Jean Gros, depicts him crossing the Alps on a rearing stallion. Never mind that in reality, he crossed the Alps on a mule. A sweaty, slow, stubby mule. But drama matters more than reality when myth is your battlefield. And this, gentle listener, is the point. Napoleon wasn't just building an army. He was constructing a narrative. Every battle had a moral. Every enemy was the embodiment of tyranny. Every French bayonet gleamed with the hope of a better republic, sharpened slightly by destiny and artistic license. But not everyone bought it. Some skeptics rolled their eyes at the heroic imagery and florid prose. A bit much, they muttered. Dramatic, they sighed. But they still read every word. Because Napoleon didn't just tell stories. He told stories people wanted to believe. In a country exhausted by guillotines, revolution, and powdered wigs, he offered something rare: focus. So, while his troops slept in wet tents and locals complained about requisitioned goats, Napoleon sat by candlelight crafting legends. Not lies. No, that would be too crude. These were elevated truths, curated realities. events lacquered in glory and sold wholesale to a nation that desperately needed a hero. One historical fact often glossed over in grand retellings: Napoleon traveled with his own printing press. That's right. Wherever he marched, the myth machine followed, printing leaflets, proclamations, and bulletins faster than most armies could boil coffee. If he won, the story was printed by dusk. If he lost, the story simply skipped that part. Even his enemies began to read him, not just his actions, but his language. Austrian generals reportedly tried to anticipate his next moves by reading between the lines of his flowery communiques. Ah, one might say, he mentioned honor 3 times and suffering twice. He must be about to attack. So, what do we make of this ink-stained general with a printing press and a passion for prose? Some say Napoleon's true genius wasn't military, but psychological. He didn't just outflank his opponents in battle, he out-narrated them. Others argue that the propaganda merely matched his ambition, and without it, France might never have followed such a tiny man into such enormous wars. Still others say he just liked the sound of his own metaphors. But one thing remains certain: Napoleon understood that history is written not by the victors, but by those with the cleanest quills and the widest readership. And so, he kept writing, and France kept listening. By the time Napoleon finished polishing his image, in Italy, he was not merely France's most victorious general, he was also its most theatrical. So, what do you do when you've conquered northern Italy, turned dispatches into literature, and grown a little bored of European mud? You plan a romantic military expedition to Egypt, of course. Yes, Egypt, land of pharaohs, pyramids, and an inconvenient amount of sand. And what exactly was Napoleon hoping to achieve by sailing across the Mediterranean to conquer an ancient land already under Ottoman rule and periodically visited by the British Navy? Well, dear listener, historians still argue whether Napoleon wanted to cut off British trade routes, revive a sort of imperial glory, or simply take his myth-building to an exotic backdrop with better lighting, perhaps all 3. Or perhaps he just wanted a holiday with uniforms. In 1798, Napoleon set sail with not only soldiers, but also 167 scholars, scientists, artists, and an entire team of botanists. Because nothing says military conquest like the study of desert weeds. They called themselves the savants, and they brought printing presses, measuring instruments, and a deep fondness for cataloging things that hadn't been categorized for several millennia. It was, in many ways, a library invasion. The army marched with books, the scientists marched with notebooks, and the mosquitoes welcomed them all equally. Quirky fact: among these savants was a man named Dominique Vivant Denon, who would later found the Louvre Museum's Egyptian collection. But on this trip, he was mainly responsible for sketching ruins and pretending not to notice when camels spat at his feet. Their first stop, Alexandria. It did not go quietly. The French stormed the city, took heavy casualties, and immediately began melting in the sun. European uniforms, designed for the damp fields of France, were ill-suited for the Egyptian summer. Soldiers fainted, horses collapsed, maps curled from the heat, and yet Napoleon pressed on, determined to make Egypt the stage for his next legend. He marched inland and soon faced the Mamluks, horse-riding warriors with sabers and centuries of tradition. At the Battle of the Pyramids, yes, that's what he called it. Branding always matters. Napoleon formed his men into massive square formations, like angry picnic blankets bristling with bayonets. The Mamluks charged with flair. The French replied with musket fire. The result was dusty, bloody, and French victory. Did the battle happen near the actual pyramids? Not exactly, but Napoleon made sure the bulletin suggested otherwise. He understood that Battle of the Pyramids sounded far more poetic than Battle of that flat area next to some rocks. And then came Cairo, and Cairo came with people. And those people didn't appreciate the sudden arrival of Frenchmen quoting Voltaire. Napoleon's men tried to govern. The locals revolted. Napoleon retaliated with brutal efficiency. The dream of Egypt as a willing stage for French enlightenment dimmed faster than a torch in a sandstorm. Meanwhile, the scholars were thriving. While soldiers dug trenches, the scientists were busy digging papyrus scrolls and limestone shards. They published La Description de l'Égypte, a massive catalogue of ruins, insects, language, and architectural fragments. Some historians even argue that the expedition did more for Egyptology than for French imperialism, which, let's be honest, was probably not the original plan. And then came the British. Oh, yes. Admiral Horatio Nelson, that one-eyed maritime buzzkill, had been lurking near the Nile. At the Battle of the Nile, the British fleet caught the French Navy anchored in Abu Qir Bay. The result? A maritime disaster for France so loud that even the mummies winced. Napoleon's ships exploded, sunk, or scattered. His route home was now extremely unavailable. His men were stranded in Egypt. Their boats were gone. Their food was melting. And the savants were still drawing beetles in the margins of ancient scrolls. So, what did Napoleon do? He lied, naturally. He announced that the army was doing just fine. He highlighted small victories. He said nothing about the boats. He used his printing press to continue broadcasting triumphs in increasingly abstract ways. Strategic redeployment replaced disastrous ambush. Provisional anchoring replaced our ships are gone. It was all very dignified. But by 1799, with things in Egypt deteriorating and news from France sounding increasingly fragile, Napoleon made the most on-brand decision possible. He abandoned his army. Yes, he left. Quietly, without announcing it, he crept aboard a ship, one of the few left, sailed back to France under cover of darkness, and left his generals and scholars to deal with malaria, British patrols, and the camel situation. Historians still argue whether this retreat was cowardly, cunning, or simply inevitable. But here's the real curiosity. Back in France, the public didn't mind. Somehow, they believed the whole Egyptian adventure had been a glorious intellectual and military success. Napoleon's myth, once again, proved sand-resistant. The Rosetta Stone, found during this campaign, a trilingual slab that would one day unlock the secrets of ancient Egyptian writing. But at the time, it was just another trophy Napoleon intended to claim credit for, even if the British eventually took it, and so, dear listener, we conclude this sand-swept chapter of confusion, hieroglyphs, and high-temperature myth-making. Egypt was not conquered, not civilized, not truly held, but it did provide Napoleon with what he loved most, a dramatic backdrop for his ego. He had gone to the land of kings. He returned ready to crown himself. Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France in October of 1799, not on a golden chariot pulled by grateful camels, but in a rather unceremonious boat, landing on the coast, wet, unannounced, and with absolutely no intention of explaining what happened in Egypt. Let's be clear, his expedition had failed. His navy was destroyed, his army was stranded, and the pyramids remained defiantly unmoved. But you wouldn't know any of this from the way Napoleon walked into Paris. No one asked questions, or rather, they did, but not out loud, and certainly not where anyone could hear. France, you see, was in chaos. The revolutionary government, the Directory, was floundering like a goose on a frozen lake. Inflation was rampant, riots were fashionable, and political instability was available in bulk. Into this mess strolled Napoleon, tan from Egyptian sun, dramatically disheveled, and radiating the kind of silent authority one acquires from self-promotion and battlefield proximity. His version of events, the expedition, was brilliant, a cultural triumph. The scholars discovered fascinating ruins, and I left because France needed me. It was a masterclass in selective memory. His allies in the press, who owed him for past favors or feared him for future ones, echoed the tale. Headlines celebrated his genius. Pamphlets praised his patriotism. A few even suggested he'd tamed the desert with nothing but a telescope and sheer determination. Quirky tidbit. One popular print showed Napoleon atop a camel, holding a telescope, staring nobly toward Europe, as if Egypt were merely the scenic overlook from which he watched over France. Back in Paris, he met secretly with key political figures. Sieyès, one of the 5 directors, had grown tired of his colleagues and saw in Napoleon a useful instrument for regime change. The others were either too busy arguing about currency reforms or had already packed their emergency luggage. And so began the quiet plotting of a coup. But don't imagine candle-lit war rooms or secret hand signals. This was France, after all, so the plotting involved opera boxes, long walks, and carefully timed sighs in public gardens. Napoleon played the reluctant savior, which, as it turns out, is a powerful posture when people are desperate enough. Historians still argue whether the entire coup was brilliantly orchestrated or haphazardly improvised. Some suggest Napoleon's brother, Lucien, did most of the actual political maneuvering. Others point to the military presence surrounding the French legislature and whisper intimidation with a raised eyebrow. The main event occurred on 1830's Brumaire, year 8th, which, for anyone using an actual calendar, was November 9th, 1799. The name comes from the French Revolutionary calendar, which was designed by people who hated weekends and enjoyed confusing historians. Napoleon entered the council chambers and was heckled. Someone called him a dictator. Others demanded he explain himself. One delegate allegedly lunged at him with a paperweight. Napoleon, unused to physical criticism, panicked and ran into the next room. Lucian saved the day with a theatrical speech. Soldiers were summoned, and the government dissolved faster than a sugar cube in hot tea. Within hours, the Directory was no more. France had a new leadership, a consulate with 3 members, Napoleon being first consul, which was exactly as modest as it sounds. And so, with the swiftness of someone sweeping a messy desk into a drawer, before guests arrive, Napoleon seized power. Did anyone vote for this? Technically, yes. A plebiscite was held, but the ballots were suspiciously abundant, the turnout miraculously high, and the counting performed with such enthusiasm that some votes may have been cast by ghosts of the revolution. But no one dared object. France had seen too many executions to be enthusiastic about dissent, and frankly, Napoleon's assent was comforting. He seemed organized. He wore clean uniforms. He didn't speak in poetry or demand the abolition of Mondays. Stability, even with bayonets, was refreshing. Thus began the consulate, with Napoleon at the helm. He moved into the Tuileries Palace, redecorated with tasteful gold and increasingly large mirrors, and began running France like a determined office manager with a war budget. He reorganized ministries, settled lawsuits, restored discipline in the army, and, most importantly, ensured that all paintings of him featured dramatic lighting and strategically hidden platforms to make him appear taller. France had exchanged chaos for choreography, and in this new chapter, Napoleon wouldn't just manage the nation. He would sculpt its image, micromanage its values, and rewrite its laws. He would be everywhere: coins, paintings, statues, dreams. The emperor had not yet crowned himself, but the country was already sleepwalking toward it. As for Egypt, it remained quietly in the background. The stranded army eventually surrendered. The British claimed victory, and the Rosetta Stone sailed off to London, presumably muttering something in 3 languages about being misunderstood. But France? France believed what Napoleon told them, that he had returned not in retreat, but in triumph. It was all part of the myth, and the myth was winning, having seized power in a moderately dramatic fashion, and declared himself first consul, a title that sounded temporary, but felt suspiciously permanent. Napoleon Bonaparte now faced his most daunting foe yet: bureaucracy. Yes, dear listener, welcome to the part of the story where administrative reform takes center stage. If you've made it this far without drifting off, rest assured, the next 1,000 words should do the trick. France, at the dawn of the consulate, was a paper-strewn mess. Departments overlapped like poorly folded laundry. Taxation was a nightmare of regional exceptions, loopholes, and convenient disappearances. The judiciary, let's just say verdicts, often depended more on fashion sense than legal principle. Napoleon, always fond of order, especially when he got to be the one doing the ordering, set to work with an energy most reserved for the coffee consumption. He began reorganizing the government as if playing a particularly aggressive round of bureaucratic Tetris. Each ministry was trimmed, shaped, and staffed with loyalists who understood the new mantra: efficiency first, democracy eventually. Historians still argue whether Napoleon genuinely believed in Republican ideals or simply enjoyed dressing them up in uniforms. What's certain is that he liked results, and results came faster when no one interrupted him. One of his first moves was to create the Council of State. Now, this wasn't a group of philosophical elders debating moral truths under olive trees. No, it was a carefully selected team of advisors who, miraculously, agreed with him most of the time. They helped draft laws, revise legal systems, and nodded solemnly when he paused dramatically mid-sentence. A quirky fact: Napoleon reportedly read every piece of legislation out loud, slowly, during council meetings, not because he enjoyed it, but because he believed hearing his own voice helped improve the clarity of law. This worked particularly well when he was the only one speaking. Now, let's talk about the judiciary, a topic so dry it spontaneously absorbs nearby moisture. Napoleon found the existing system too whimsical. Judges were inconsistent. Trials resembled philosophical salons. So, he proposed a new code, one that would be clear, logical, and enforceable from Brittany to Marseille. Thus began the birth of the Napoleonic Code, or Code Civil, for those who enjoy saying things in French to feel fancier. It was a comprehensive overhaul of civil law, stripping away the patchwork of feudal relics and replacing it with something neat, precise, and intimidatingly indexed. It covered property, contracts, family law, essentially everything people argue about before dinner. It removed privileges of birth, established equality before the law, well, for men, and made divorce legal. Though not necessarily pleasant, the code became one of France's most significant exports, right behind wine, cheese, and unrequested opinions. But Napoleon didn't stop there. He restructured France's finances by creating the Banque de France in 1800. Unlike previous attempts at banking, which mostly ended in scandal and sheepish retreats, this one actually stuck. It stabilized the currency, collected taxes, and made it slightly harder for nobles to misplace entire fortunes. To ensure the government functioned properly, Napoleon also revived the art of surveillance. Prefects were appointed to monitor every department like stern nannies with excellent handwriting. They filed reports, enforced policies, and made sure no local mayor got any revolutionary ideas after dessert. Even education came under his gaze. He established lycées, government-run secondary schools, for training future bureaucrats, engineers, and people who could memorize large documents without sighing too loudly. Meritocracy became fashionable, especially when merit could be conveniently defined as agreeing with Napoleon. Still, despite all these changes, the first consul insisted that his role was temporary. He even held a referendum to prove it. Would you like Napoleon to continue guiding France as first consul for 10 years? The ballot asked. The results came back. Roughly 3 million said yes, and 1,500 said no. Whether all 3 million were conscious during the vote remains unsurprisingly unknown. Fringe tidbit. At one point, Napoleon reportedly quipped, "I am a creature of circumstances," which is a polite way of saying, "I will do whatever suits me at the moment." Dressed up in philosophical robes, France, meanwhile, seemed content, exhausted by revolution, chaos, and too many dates that began with 9 Thermidor. They welcomed the calm, the order, and the increasing number of buildings with Napoleon's initials carved into the stone. And the man himself? He wandered the corridors of power in his gray coat and thoughtful expression, sipping lukewarm wine and contemplating how best to reshape Europe. Quietly, slowly, and with impeccable handwriting. By the end of 1802, the Constitution had been revised again. This time, Napoleon was made first consul for life, a surprising development only if you had been asleep since 1795. Historians still argue whether the French people were genuinely supportive or just profoundly tired. But no one can deny that, in terms of domestic administration, Napoleon was a tireless architect of the modern French state, armed with blueprints, blunt pencils, and an unusually high tolerance for paperwork. And so, amid stacks of parchment and clinks of inkwells, the coup of Brumaire transformed into a government machine, with Napoleon at its humming, micromanaged center. Sleepy yet? In the grand halls of Notre Dame Cathedral, on a chilly morning in December 1804, a man stood before a throne, flanked by velvet, incense, and at least 3 dozen bored cardinals. His name, of course, was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was about to crown himself Emperor of the French. Yes, crown himself. It's a curious gesture, really. Most monarchs receive their crowns from popes or bishops in solemn deference to divine authority. Napoleon? He plucked the crown from Pope Pius VII, trembling hands, and placed it atop his own slightly tousled head, like a man fixing his own hair before a portrait. Quirky historical fact. Some say the Pope muttered a prayer. Others say he blinked twice and sighed. Either way, the symbolic gesture was clear. Napoleon bowed to no one, not even heaven's HR department. Let us rewind slightly. By 1804, the consulate had grown, let's say, elaborate, though Napoleon had claimed he was merely a humble servant of the Republic. His home decor and fashion choices suggested otherwise. Gold embroidery crept onto everything. His official portraits started to look like those Baroque oil paintings you see in antique shops next to suspiciously expensive clocks, and his titles increasing in length. First consul became consul for life. Then, with a few tweaks to the Constitution and another conveniently successful referendum, he added Emperor of the French to his resume. Historians still argue whether the coronation was a bold reinvention of monarchy or just an elaborate costume party with real political consequences. What is certain is that Napoleon left nothing to chance. Every element of the ceremony was choreographed. The music, the lighting, even the placement of courtiers. It was less a religious rite and more a live theater production with unusually expensive seats. The regalia was, of course, impressive. The crown itself, known as the Crown of Charlemagne, was a replica made especially for the occasion. The real one, a relic of France's royal past, had been melted down during the Revolution, as had many other symbols, including manners and stability. Napoleon's version was designed to evoke legacy without admitting lineage. He also wore a long white robe embroidered with golden bees. Yes, bees. Because bees were ancient symbols of immortality, power, and apparently uncomfortable embroidery. Seated beside him during the ceremony was Josephine, his wife, draped in jewels and apprehension. Their marriage, you see, had been stormier than a November picnic in Corsica. He had recently discovered she could not provide him with an heir, but for today, they played their parts. He as the destined emperor, she as his radiant consort. As Napoleon lifted the crown, silence filled the cathedral. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. Then, with the flourish of someone adjusting his own laurel wreath in a mirror, he lowered it onto his own head. This, he believed, was theater as legitimacy, and for the French people, watching, via newspaper illustrations and flowery prose, it worked. The revolution had given them chaos. Napoleon gave them choreography. But there were skeptics, of course. One pamphlet described the coronation as an empire built atop the ruins of republican virtue. Another anonymous poet wrote, "He took the crown like he takes his coffee, strong, hot, and without permission." Even the Pope, after the ceremony, reportedly remarked to a cardinal, "Well, at least we're still invited." Still, the new emperor wasted no time justifying his new title. He launched an imperial household, complete with marshals, chamberlains, and a roster of courtiers whose sole duty was to nod, bow, and avoid saying the wrong thing at dinner. He commissioned imperial coins, embroidered curtains, and had official painters depict him as a Roman god with softer lighting. One fringe detail, Napoleon demanded that official state bedsheets include his monogram in gold thread, NB, so that even his naps were consistent with imperial branding. And let us not forget the Napoleonic bees. They multiplied, appearing on uniforms, banners, and upholstery across France. Some citizens even claimed bees began appearing in their dreams, buzzing in Latin and whispering tax codes. Scholars still debate whether this was symbolic genius or early signs of obsessive marketing. But amid all this opulence, a quiet question persisted. Was this still the revolution's dream? After all, the revolution had guillotined kings. Now, it applauded an emperor. Liberty had worn a red cap. Now she curtsied in a ballroom. Égalité had become a footnote embroidered on gold brocade. Yet, the streets were quiet. The bread queues were shorter, and the army, oh, the army, was marching in perfect rhythm. France, in its exhaustion, accepted the crown as a kind of weighted blanket. It might not have been freedom, but it was warm, structured, and mercifully predictable. And so Napoleon, crowned not by the church, but by himself, stood atop the altar like a man who'd climbed a mountain and then named it after himself. He declared that the revolution's ideals lived on, in him, through him, and slightly behind him, in the shadows. The French Empire was born. Its leader was brilliant, theatrical, and thoroughly in charge. And Josephine, she smiled, adjusted her tiara, and wondered if this robe came in annulment friendly. By the year 1809, the imperial household, so grand, so gilded, so fragrant with imported incense, faced a delicate issue that no amount of drapery could hide. The emperor had no heir. Napoleon Bonaparte, despite conquering Europe and crowning himself in dramatic fashion, could not quite conjure a child with Josephine. The problem wasn't for lack of effort or embroidered nightwear. It was, as confirmed by various royal physicians and muttering courtiers, entirely due to Josephine's side of the equation. She had a children from a previous marriage, but none had arrived with a Bonaparte surname. And so, after years of devotion, drama, and diamond-laden apologies, the imperial couple faced the most awkward conversation in French history, an annulment that was both political strategy and emotional minefield. Let's pause here to admire the paradox. This was a man who had rewritten entire codes of law, micromanaged military uniforms, and personally edited his own war bulletins. Yet, when it came time to tell his wife of 14 years that she was no longer Empress material, he hesitated. Historical sources differ, of course. Some claim Napoleon wept as he told Josephine. Others insist she fainted. Still others say they shared a quiet dinner, followed by a long walk and a mutual understanding worthy of a Jane Austen subplot. The official version, however, was presented like a formal duet in a carefully choreographed public ceremony. Both Napoleon and Josephine read prepared statements. He declared his affection. She accepted her fate, and the courtiers nodded with solemnity while mentally updating seating charts. Quirky tidbit: Josephine kept her title of Empress even after the divorce, and she also kept her palace, her staff, and her extensive shoe collection. In terms of historical breakups, this was a 5-star arrangement. Historians still argue whether Josephine truly accepted the decision or simply mastered the art of dignified retreat. Her letters to friends hint at heartbreak. Her fashion choices afterward suggest revenge by lace. Meanwhile, Napoleon turned his attention to finding a new bride, preferably one with a uterus blessed by diplomacy. Enter Marie-Louise of Austria, a Habsburg princess with impeccable lineage, excellent posture, and no choice in the matter. She was the grandniece of Marie Antoinette, which meant her family had once been guillotined by the same revolution Napoleon now claimed to represent. Love, clearly, was not the foundation of this union, but alliances were. Austria, having recently been defeated in battle, saw the marriage as a way to keep Napoleon from further rearranging the map of Europe. And Napoleon, he saw it as a way to create an heir, solidify his legacy, and add a touch of old world legitimacy to his New World empire. Their wedding, held in 1810, was predictably opulent. Gold, pearls, orchestras, and several hundred guests who knew better than to mention Josephine. Marie-Louise was 18. Napoleon was 40. The wedding night, according to whispered rumors, included multiple toasts, a satin-draped bedroom, and a scheduled time slot. Within a year, their son was born, Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph, styled the King of Rome before he could walk. Napoleon was ecstatic. He paraded the baby through the palace, commissioned portraits, and declared his dynasty secure. He even built a cradle so ornate it required its own footmen. But beneath the gilded surface, cracks formed. Marie-Louise, while dutiful, remained emotionally distant. She found Paris stifling, the court tedious, and her new husband's habits, such as reviewing troops at dawn and reciting Roman history during dinner, somewhat exhausting. Still, She played her role. She appeared at balls, posed for portraits, and birthed the emperor's legacy without a fuss. Her diary entries, though rare, suggest a kind of resigned elegance. The crown is heavy, but the pillows are nice. As for Josephine, she retreated to Malmaison, her beloved estate outside Paris. There, she cultivated roses, entertained artists, and remained a quiet yet persistent echo in Napoleon's life. He wrote to her, occasionally visited, and once said, "She is the only woman I have truly loved," which makes the annulment feel less like a page in history and more like the world's most luxurious heartbreak. One fringe anecdote tells of Josephine commissioning a portrait of herself after the divorce, wearing full imperial regalia, as if to say, "You may replace me, but you will never erase me." And so, the empire moved forward, with a new empress, a new heir, and a new chapter. But the ghost of Josephine, fragrant with jasmine and armed with impeccable taste, lingered in the halls of memory. France had a royal family now, complete with nursery, nanny, and political undertones. The emperor had what he wanted, a future. Whether it would last, well, that's a story for another section. By 1812, Napoleon stood at the summit of his own meticulously engineered mountain, an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the edges of Russia, populated by vassal kings, redrawn borders, and admirers who'd memorized the correct angle at which to bow. The man who once sold books to pay rent now had entire cities renamed in his honor. France, under his rule, had become a strange cocktail of imperial grandeur and bureaucratic frenzy. Laws were standardized. Education was reformed. Roads, bridges, and even cemeteries bore his initials. If it didn't say N somewhere, it probably wasn't state approved. Mainstream historical fact. At the height of Napoleon's empire, his influence touched over 70 million people across Europe. That's a lot of people to impress with fancy uniforms. Court life had reached new levels of ceremony. Napoleon's daily schedule was a masterpiece of micromanagement, beginning with state meetings and ending with dinner stories about Caesar, Charlemagne, or, on slow days, himself. The imperial guard marched daily, polished and precise, like animated decorations. Artists painted Napoleon as everything from a Roman god to a kindly father. Poets rhymed about his glory. Even coins bore his profile, half majestic, half mildly suspicious. But behind the gold curtains, red flags began to flutter. First, the Peninsular War in Spain. Spain, you see, had not appreciated being liberated by French troops. Instead of welcoming their new emperor with baguettes and gratitude, the Spanish launched a guerrilla resistance so fierce and persistent that even Napoleon called it the Spanish ulcer. Then came the growing resentment in German and Austrian territories. Nationalism, this pesky concept that people might prefer their own cultures, began to whisper in salons and lecture halls. And of course, there was Britain. That island, perpetually foggy and annoyingly resilient, refused to bow. Napoleon's continental system, designed to starve Britain economically by banning European trade with it, ended up hurting French merchants far more than English ones. Black markets flourished. British goods snuck in through Portugal, Prussia, and the occasional well-bribed donkey. quirky historical tidbit: smuggled British textiles became so common in France that imperial cotton became a euphemism for fabric with mysterious origins. And speaking of mysterious origins, Napoleon's diplomatic relationships were fraying. His siblings, whom he had placed on thrones across Europe like imperial chess pieces, proved to be surprisingly ungrateful. His brother Joseph, whom Napoleon made King of Spain, struggled to control even his own palace. Louis, King of Holland, insisted on ruling with conscience, which Napoleon found inconvenient, and Jerome, oh Jerome, treated the Kingdom of Westphalia like a year-long costume party. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's empire was collapsing under its own weight or simply allergic to delegation. Meanwhile, the emperor continued to expand. He annexed territories, drafted new troops, and insisted that everything, from opera seating to school curricula, match his vision of orderly greatness. But the signs of overstretch were becoming clearer. Economically, France groaned under the burden of constant warfare. Conscription increased, and villages across the countryside whispered about sons who left and never returned. Nobles grumbled, merchants hedged, priests, once cowed, began to mumble dissent behind altars. Even the capital grew tired. Paris, once dazzled by his victories, began to frown at the taxes, the censorship, the endless marches. The city still applauded during parades, but the clapping had grown slower, like applause at the 10th encore of a concert no one asked for. And yet, Napoleon remained dazzling on the surface. He still entered rooms like a thunderclap wrapped in silk. He still signed decrees with flair and lectured ministers on the virtues of Egyptian architecture. He still kissed his son's forehead like a man sealing a contract. But cracks appeared. One fringe anecdote tells of a servant who claimed Napoleon once stood alone in his study, gazing at a map, muttering, "Even Caesar didn't have to deal with customs reports." It's hard to say whether that's true, but the sentiment that the burden of an empire had begun to outweigh its theater is echoed in the diaries of those closest to him. Marie-Louise wrote fewer letters. His marshals smiled less. His ministers spoke more carefully. The empire, for all its gold leaf and trumpets, had begun to tilt. And then, of course, came Russia. But we'll get to that in the next section. For now, picture an emperor at his most powerful, draped in velvet, crowned in confidence, surrounded by glittering generals. And note that beneath the stage, the floorboards had started to creak. In 1812, Napoleon decided it was time to bring a little French discipline to Russia, a land of icy vastness, unpredictable alliances, and a penchant for outlasting invaders. Russia seemed to most like the worst possible place to plan a summer field trip. But to Napoleon, it was a loose end in his masterpiece of continental control, and he hated loose ends almost as much as he hated poorly ironed tunics. And so, he prepared his Grande Armée. It was the largest military force Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers drawn from across the empire and its allies. Frenchmen, Poles, Italians, Germans, and even reluctant Prussians. A marching, multicultural tour of uniforms, flags, and languages. Mainstream historical fact: the Grande Armée was so large that it took nearly 2 hours for it to pass a single checkpoint. Plan was simple, or rather, Napoleon's version of simple: march to Moscow, force Tsar Alexander I into submission, and return to Paris with peace treaties, fine vodka, and another bust for the palace hallway. But Russia had other ideas. Tsar Alexander, upon hearing of the approaching French forces, did not engage in pitched battles. Instead, he employed a tactic so ancient and annoying that it felt almost rude: retreat and burn. The Russian army fled eastward, torching towns, fields, and supply lines as they went. Every village became a blackened ghost. Every granary vanished in flames. Even the wells were poisoned, because apparently hydration was negotiable. As the Grande Armée advanced, it found nothing but ash and echoes. Quirky historical tidbit: in some villages, Russian peasants reportedly painted false roads to confuse French scouts. One general claimed to have followed a path that led directly into a frozen swamp. It looked official, he reportedly muttered. Still, Napoleon pressed it forward. By September, they reached Moscow, or what was left of it. The Russian capital, rather than surrendering, had been abandoned and set ablaze by its own citizens. Flames devoured wooden buildings. Smoke curled into the sky like a shrug. Napoleon entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a confused tenant. Waited 1 week, then another. He wrote letters. He paced. He stared out frost-covered windows. But Tsar Alexander never replied. No envoy arrived. No treaty was offered. Just silence and snow. Historians still argue whether Napoleon truly believed he could winter in Moscow, or if he simply stalled, hoping the Russian will to resist would melt before the frost set in. It did not. Instead, winter arrived. Dramatic, early, and unforgiving. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees Celsius. Horses froze mid-step. Muskets jammed. Soldiers wrapped their boots in rags, burned anything that resembled wood, and boiled leather belts for soup. Frostbite became the official uniform of the season. Napoleon finally ordered the retreat, but the way back was worse than the way in. Russian forces harassed the columns. Roads turned to slush, and then ice. Bridges collapsed. Wagons broke, and the Berezina River, usually a modest inconvenience, became a watery grave for thousands. One fringe anecdote claims that Napoleon, in despair, stood atop a pile of frozen baggage and whispered, "This was not in the brochure." By the time what remained of the Grande Armée limped back across the border, fewer than 100,000 men remained. Of the original 600,000, most had perished, deserted, or disappeared into Russian snowdrifts. And the emperor, he fled early, riding ahead in a sleigh toward Paris to manage the political fallout. His departure was pragmatic, but poorly timed. The image of a leader abandoning his army in the frost clung to his reputation like frost on a mustache. Back in France, propaganda spun the disaster as a strategic withdrawal. Newspapers blamed the weather. Ministers blamed logistics. Napoleon blamed the Russians for their unwillingness to fight like civilized people. With city limits and cannon lines. But the truth was simple. The campaign had been a hubris-fueled march into the abyss, a cautionary tale wrapped in icicles and arrogance. The once invincible emperor had met his match, not in battle, but in endurance. And the empire, it trembled. Allies reconsidered, enemies stirred. Paris whispered. The man who had crowned himself was now cloaked in the frost of failure, and though he still sat on a throne, the chill of Russia followed him home, settling into his dreams, his court, and the very bones of his ambition. If the Russian winter had frozen Napoleon's invincibility, what followed was the slow, relentless thawing of his empire's foundations. News of the Moscow disaster spread like cold butter on stale bread, unevenly. But it got there, and once it did, things began to unravel with the grace of a sock caught on a nail. In the aftermath of 1812, Napoleon scrambled to rebuild. He raised new armies, summoned loyal marshals, and made impassioned speeches about sacrifice, duty, and the slightly overrated danger of frostbite. But Europe had seen the crack, and like blood in water, it attracted sharks. Mainstream historical fact. Within months of the Russian campaign, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Britain had coalesced into the Sixth Coalition, a polite euphemism for everyone Napoleon ever annoyed. Former allies turned cold. Neutral nations leaned away. Even loyal subjects began murmuring into their soup. Still, Napoleon marched. He fought battles across Germany, most notably the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, a confrontation so massive it was called the Battle of the Nations, involving over 600,000 troops from all sides. The scale was epic. The result? Not so flattering. Despite impressive tactical moves and more cavalry charges than could be reasonably remembered, Napoleon lost. The French were forced to retreat westward, abandoning much of Germany. Saxony waved goodbye. Bavaria tiptoed out of the room. And Paris? It watched nervously. Napoleon's once unshakable mystique had begun to resemble wet wallpaper, peeling at the corners, losing its grip. The emperor returned to France bruised but undeterred, as if sheer willpower could outpace geopolitics. Meanwhile, internal problems multiplied. Conscription ramped up again. Young boys were drafted with promises of glory, and uniforms 2 sizes too big. The economy limped. Inflation crept. Food prices climbed. And in the cafes of Paris, whispered jokes about General Winter earned cautious chuckles and sideways glances, quirky historical tidbit. Due to fabric shortages, some new army recruits in 1813 were issued uniforms made partially of paper. They didn't hold up well in the rain, or under cannon fire, or at all. And then there was Spain, still burning. The Peninsular War dragged on, a never-ending parade of ambushes, setbacks, and angry locals, wielding whatever wasn't nailed down. British forces under Wellington pushed steadily northward. French morale, meanwhile, fell faster than a powdered wig in a thunderstorm. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's inability to let go of Spain, despite mounting losses, was strategic stubbornness or personal pride, or both. Likely both. At court, things grew tense. Ministers walked softly. Generals exchanged glances. The Empress Marie-Louise watched the nursery window as their toddler son played blissfully unaware that his father's empire was being folded like a badly creased map. Napoleon became more rigid, more suspicious. He dismissed old allies, replaced commanders, rewrote laws, redrew borders, and yet the walls kept closing in. By early 1814, coalition forces had crossed into France itself. Russian troops in the east, Prussians in the north, Austrians approaching from the southeast. Like a particularly aggressive bake sale, there were invaders on every road. Napoleon, to his credit, fought back with remarkable energy. His 1814 campaign is considered one of his most brilliant. Smaller forces, rapid maneuvers, near miraculous victories. But brilliance was no longer enough. There were simply too many enemies, too few soldiers, too little time. One fringe account claims that during this campaign, Napoleon slept in a farmhouse stable and gave an impromptu lecture to a cow about the strategic blunders of Tsar Alexander. The cow was unmoved, and then came the real blow. Paris fell, not with fiery explosions or cinematic duels, but with quiet surrender. The city, exhausted and outmaneuvered, opened its gates. The Senate, ever flexible in its loyalties, declared Napoleon deposed. He returned not as a ruler, but as a relic, and in April 1814, the once self-crowned Emperor of the French signed an abdication at Fontainebleau. No throne, no army, no empire, just a farewell to his guards, a tearful speech, and a one-way ticket to a tiny Mediterranean island no one could quite locate on the first try. His name, Elba. His status, exiled, but not, as we shall see, defeated. For now, though, let's pause on a man seated in a gilded carriage, staring out at the French countryside he no longer governed, wondering, perhaps, if all of it had simply been too much. Napoleon arrived at the island of Elba in May 1814, not as a prisoner, nor as a tourist, but as the strangest of creatures, an emperor in retirement, a Mediterranean speck, barely 86 square miles in size. Elba was better known for its iron mines, salty winds, and mild olives than for housing deposed titans of European conquest. And yet, there he was. The terms of his abdication granted him rule over the island. Yes, rule. Napoleon wasn't banished in chains. He was given a title, a personal guard of 600 men, and even a budget, courtesy of the French treasury, which had the collective energy of a groan by this point. Mainstream historical fact. Napoleon's official title on Elba was Emperor of Elba. That's right. He remained an emperor, just of fewer goats. So, what does a man do when he's gone from ruling Europe to supervising Mediterranean sheep? Well, he governs. Napoleon took his new role on Elba with unsettling enthusiasm. He reorganized the local government, revamped agriculture, improved the road system, opened schools, inspected the mines, created a flag for Elba, a white banner with a red stripe, and 3 bees. Why bees? Because bees are hardworking, industrious, loyal. Also, they don't argue with their emperor. Quirky historical tidbit. Locals were baffled when Napoleon commissioned a full military parade through Portoferreo to inspect the 3 cannons that still functioned. One islander allegedly muttered, "It's just us and the goats," Who are we scaring? But for all his activity, there was something hollow in it. Napoleon paced more, slept less, wrote letters to former marshals, read military reports that no longer mattered, and stared across the sea toward France, where his ex-wife Josephine was dying, and his young son had been taken to Vienna by Marie Louise's father, the Austrian emperor. Historians still argue whether Napoleon truly believed he could live out his days on Elba in peace, or whether he was simply biding time, watching the political currents, like a man watching the tide from a leaky dinghy. Because Europe hadn't really settled. The Congress of Vienna, that great diplomatic gathering of noblemen in wigs and egos, was still trying to sew the continent back together with mismatched thread. Borders were redrawn, monarchs were restored, and in France, the Bourbons returned in the form of Louis XVIII, a man who, by most accounts, had the charisma of a damp sponge. Discontent simmered. French citizens grumbled about royalist excess, high taxes, and the fact that their new king couldn't really walk without help. Rumors trickled across the sea. Napoleon, ever alert, devoured every whisper like dessert. And his supporters, they hadn't disappeared. Letters arrived. Secret visitors came by boat. Coins bearing Napoleon's face reappeared in marketplaces. Some even claimed to see his profile in bread crusts, though that was likely just hunger and nostalgia. One fringe story claims a Corsican fisherman sailed to Elba just to salute Napoleon, whispering, "We're ready when you are," before paddling away into the night. Napoleon began planning. He timed the royalist festivals in France, noted the position of British ships, counted provisions, practiced speeches, rehearsed marches, and waited for the moment when Europe would blink. In February 1815, with British guards conveniently distracted, some say by dinner, others by an unfortunate wine incident, Napoleon slipped away from Elba aboard a small ship with 1,000 loyal troops. No grand invasion, no warships, just a gamble, and a lot of very determined rowing. He landed in the south of France, stepped ashore in his old military uniform, and announced that the emperor had returned. And the most shocking part, people cheered. Soldiers sent to arrest him joined his march. Towns welcomed him with flowers. Generals switched sides mid-toast. It was the political equivalent of an ex showing up uninvited and somehow getting re-invited to everything. Louis XVIII fled. Ministers panicked. And by the time Napoleon reached Paris, his comeback was complete. The exile was over. The island of Elba faded into footnote, and thus began the most audacious footnote in history. The 100 Days. When Napoleon returned from Elba in 1815, the world blinked, not in disbelief, not in horror, but more like a prolonged, exasperated sigh, because here he was again, the man who had once redrawn the face of Europe, now marching from the Mediterranean coast with a ragtag army and the sheer force of vibes. Mainstream historical fact: Napoleon's triumphant return to Paris took just 3 weeks, during which not a single shot was fired. Troops sent to capture him either hesitated, defected, or cheered. One battalion is said to have shouted, "Vive l'Empereur," before even hearing his speech. Louis XVIII having mastered the art of timely disappearance, fled to Belgium. The Bourbon monarchy was once again tossed like a baguette into a canal. Napoleon was back, but not quite in full imperial splendor. No coronation, no grand declarations, just brisk governance and a promise he would not seek conquest, only defend France. Europe was not convinced. The major powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, reconvened in gritted teeth consensus. Napoleon's comeback, they agreed, was like reopening an old wound and asking for tetanus. They declared him an outlaw, an enemy of peace, and within weeks, they began to mobilize. Napoleon, meanwhile, began assembling an army. He reorganized command, rallied veterans, and issued rousing bulletins filled with phrases like honor, liberty, and somewhat urgent mobilization. He had only one real option: strike first. So he turned toward Belgium, where British and Prussian forces were massing. The goal? Defeat them before they could properly unite and ruin his second debut. The plan was daring, perhaps even brilliant, but brilliance alone doesn't guarantee good weather or punctual reinforcements. Quirky historical tidbit: Napoleon's army included soldiers who had served under him, then under Louis XVI, and now once again under Napoleon, all within 6 months. Their loyalty lay mostly with whoever provided boots that fit. The decisive confrontation came in June 1815 in a damp, muddy field south of a small Belgian village. The name, Waterloo. It wasn't meant to be the end, just another tactical display, another masterpiece of maneuver. But from the start, the omens were unimpressive. The battlefield was a slippery mess. Delays plagued troop movements. Communications frayed like poorly knotted shoelaces. And Marshal Ney, a man of legendary courage but questionable timing, launched premature attacks that confused even the mapmakers. Meanwhile, the Duke of Wellington, leading the British, was positioned defensively on the ridge. He didn't need flash. He just needed to hold. Napoleon's attacks surged, faltered, regrouped, and surged again. The Imperial Guard, once his most feared unit, made its fateful charge, only to be repelled. Prussian forces under Blucher arrived late in the day, like a surprise guest at a funeral, sealing the outcome. Historians still argue whether Napoleon lost Waterloo due to weather, bad luck, miscommunication, or simply fatigue. A man stretched too thin for too long. By nightfall, the field was littered with wreckage, bodies, abandoned cannons, torn banners, and, somewhere in the mud, the last true hope of Napoleonic dominance. He fled, not to Elba this time. That was already used, but to Paris, where even his most loyal supporters began rehearsing sentences with the word abdication. The dream was over. Again. Only this time, there was no comeback planned, no island budget, no ceremonial guard, just consequences. Napoleon surrendered to Captain Maitland of the British ship HMS Bellerophon, expressing a hope for asylum in Britain. The British, ever punctual, responded with a less generous offer: permanent exile. Destination? A volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, 200 miles from anywhere interesting. Its name? St. Helena. Population? Indifferent goats, and even more indifferent British jailers. Napoleon's second abdication had no flair, no golden farewell, just a sea voyage under guard, a trunk of memoirs, and the bitter realization that the story had truly reached its epilogue, but not quite its ending. That comes later. Napoleon arrived at St. Helena in October of 1815, aboard the HMS Northumberland. If Elba was a polite timeout, St. Helena was a cosmic practical joke, located in the middle of the South Atlantic, roughly equidistant from nowhere, and never heard of it. The island had two principal features: rocks, more rocks. Mainstream historical fact: the island of St. Helena is only 47 square miles in size and was used as a remote British outpost long before Napoleon ever considered being exiled there. The British chose it precisely because escape was, shall we say, discouraged by geography. Upon arrival, Napoleon was granted residence at Longwood House, a damp, wind-battered villa located on the island's interior plateau. Though technically better than a prison cell, it was a far cry from the marble halls of Tuileries, or even the goat paths of Elba. And here, for 6 long years, he would stew. British supervision was tight. Sir Hudson Lowe, his appointed jailer-governor, maintained surveillance with the enthusiasm of a man who took passive-aggressive letters very seriously. Quirky historical tidbit: Napoleon once had a heated argument with Lowe over the correct etiquette for sending letters via British courier. This spat lasted 3 weeks and ended in absolute silence. On both sides, Napoleon, ever the workaholic, did not take well to forced idleness. He rose early, walked the gardens, dictated memoirs to loyal aides, and endlessly replayed military campaigns on improvised maps made from biscuits and inkpots. He wrote letters, he read history, he tried to grow vegetables, with mixed success. Historians still argue whether he was truly broken by St. Helena's isolation, or if the real torment came from knowing that his story now depended entirely on how it was remembered. Because that became his obsession, Napoleon began curating his legacy with surgical precision. Every anecdote, every reflection, every sigh was part of the myth-building. He instructed aides, like Emmanuel de las Cases, to record his thoughts, framing himself not as a warmonger, but as a misunderstood reformer, a man who brought order to chaos, progress to Europe, and of course, drama to small islands. Meanwhile, the British kept watching. Guards patrolled nightly. Letters were censored. Visitors were vetted. At one point, rumors of an escape plan prompted Lowe to increase naval presence, despite the nearest land being 200 miles away, and Napoleon being, well, not really in shape for rowing. As the years passed, Napoleon's health deteriorated. The island's climate, damp and moldy, did little to help. He suffered from stomach pains, fatigue, and increasing melancholy. Doctors argued over the diagnosis. Was it ulcers? Cancer? Poetic justice? One fringe account says Napoleon believed the British were slowly poisoning him, possibly with copper pipes or low morale. His hair fell out. His walks shortened. The fire dimmed. But even then, he dictated. He corrected manuscripts. He made jokes about marshals who had betrayed him, and he stared at the horizon, where the sea shimmered like the memories of fallen empires. A single tree in the Longwood garden became his favorite spot. He would sit beneath it for hours, cloaked in a greatcoat, staring at nothing, as if trying to spot France beyond the clouds. And perhaps in his mind, he did, because even surrounded by goats and fog, Napoleon remained Napoleon, a man allergic to obscurity, a man who turned even exile into an epilogue worthy of footnotes. The myth was working. In France, public opinion shifted. Paintings of Napoleon as a heroic martyr began to circulate. Children were taught his campaigns. Books glorified his laws, and coins minted in secret showed him crowned by angels. Napoleon's body was on a rock in the ocean, but his story was back on the continent, growing stronger with each passing year, and he knew it. He had lost the war, but he was winning the memory. Napoleon's final years on St. Helena were a curious blend of monotony and intentional myth-making. Even as his health crumbled like an overbaked souffle, his mind remained focused on immortality, not of the body, but of reputation. Mainstream historical fact. By 1820, Napoleon was visibly deteriorating. He had frequent gastric pains, nausea, and weakness. His doctors scribbled symptoms into journals and politely debated diagnoses while keeping him on a diet that can best be described as boiled. He spent his days reclining, dictating, correcting grammar, and sometimes just staring at walls. Sleep was elusive, appetite unpredictable. Conversations with aides like Montholon and Bertrand became circular, sometimes reflective, and often bitter. He blamed the British. He blamed the climate. He blamed the wallpaper, which, ironically, modern scientists later discovered contained arsenic-based dyes, because of course it did. But amid the slow spiral of decline, Napoleon became strangely lucid about his image. He spoke of Caesar, of Alexander, of Charlemagne, always as peers, never as unreachable titans. I, he said once, am history's pivot. Quirky historical tidbit. Napoleon had portraits of himself sent to Europe with exaggerated poses and added heroic lighting. One shows him wrapped in a Roman toga while standing beside a broken chain. St. Helena looked suspiciously like Mount Olympus. He dictated military campaigns, offering commentary so detailed it baffled his secretaries. Here, he'd say, make sure they know my cavalry was outnumbered. Not late. Anecdotes were retold with new endings. Missteps were reframed. Waterloo became a noble miscalculation. The Russian winter became the true villain. The coup of 18 Brumaire, a necessary sneeze, in the name of order. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's final years were delusional or simply strategic. Was he rewriting reality or merely editing the footnotes? In 1821, his health sharply declined. Fevers set in. His complexion paled. He began spending most of his time in bed, dictating less, sleeping more, and retreating inward. A Catholic priest was summoned. Though once indifferent to religion, Napoleon accepted last rites, perhaps for peace, perhaps for optics. After all, what's a final act without closure? In his will, he requested to be buried on the banks of the Seine, near the people he loved. The British, ever pragmatic, said no. Instead, on May 5th, 1821, after a long, slow, unremarkable struggle, Napoleon died at Longwood House. There was no lightning, no dramatic storm, just wind, a creaking shutter, and silence. His last words, according to some accounts, were, France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine. Others claim he mumbled about marshals and maps. One report insists he simply asked for more blankets. And so, the man who crowned himself emperor, who redrew Europe and turned exile into theater, exited the stage. The British embalmed his body, photographed it with awkward reverence, and buried him beneath a simple tombstone labeled Napoleon. No dates, no titles, just the name. Because even in death, simplicity could be powerful. And back in France, the myth bloomed like an overwatered geranium. Books were printed, memoirs published, plays staged. Children whispered his name. In alleyways, Bonapartist movements surged. Some called for his son to rise. Others merely wore pins with a capital N. The legend was doing something Napoleon hadn't managed since Leipzig, advancing. Years later, under Louis Philippe, the French negotiated the return of Napoleon's remains. In 1840, after nearly 2 decades, his body arrived back in France to a reception so grand it would have made Austerlitz blush. He was interred at Les Invalides, in a sarcophagus beneath a golden dome, where tourists now shuffle quietly, half awake, wondering if this is all a bit too much. And maybe that's the point, because Napoleon, for all his flaws, understood one thing better than most. History doesn't remember what happened. It remembers what it was told. In the years following his death, Napoleon's legacy transformed from controversial general to near mythological figure, much like a historical Pokemon evolution, except with more artillery. Mainstream historical fact: Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides, completed in the mid-19th century, became a pilgrimage site for Bonapartists, tourists, and school children forced to admire the glory of France in reverent silence. The tomb is a circular crypt, nestled beneath a golden dome, surrounded by marble statues of military virtues such as victory, valor, and of course, mandatory field trips. People came to gaze at his sarcophagus, made of red quartzite and green granite, imported from Finland, because nothing says humble like imported rock from a different climate zone. Back in the realm of words, Napoleon's image underwent constant remodeling. In some biographies, he was a brilliant reformer, bringing secular law and modern administration to chaotic Europe. In others, a ruthless warmonger, obsessed with power and dramatically allergic to peace treaties. Napoleon himself would have been delighted by both versions, as long as they spelled his name correctly. Quirky historical tidbit: the phrase, "not tonight," Josephine, is often attributed to Napoleon. There's absolutely no evidence he ever said it. In fact, it likely emerged from a Victorian comedy sketch. But hey, it's catchy, and now it's on mugs. Statues of Napoleon began popping up across France, each one offering a slightly different vibe. Some showed him in military uniform, stern and windswept. Others in Roman garb, pointing dramatically at something. A few even depict him wearing a hat 3 sizes too large, as if modeling for a revolutionary fashion line. Historians still argue whether Napoleon was a tyrant, a genius, or simply a charismatic spreadsheet with legs. The debates never end, because Napoleon is the kind of historical figure who invites obsession. In literature, he appears in everything from Tolstoy's War and Peace to modern political essays. In cinema, he's portrayed by actors ranging from tall and brooding to short and sweaty. Everyone wants their own Napoleon. Napoleon as revolutionary, Napoleon as emperor, Napoleon as victim, Napoleon as misunderstood genius with digestive issues. And in this chaos of retellings, something remarkable happened. The man disappeared, and only the symbol remained. Napoleon became shorthand for ambition, for hubris, for complicated maps. Schools teach about his legal reforms. Psychologists reference the Napoleon complex. Economists discuss his role in the Continental blockade. And bored teenagers pretend to pay attention during PowerPoints about Austerlitz. Even nations he once invaded, like Italy and Germany, now feature Napoleon in museums, as if he were a slightly aggressive houseguest who left behind silverware and street names. He's remembered less as a man and more as a phenomenon. But if you strip away the paintings, the myths, the music, and the memes, you're left with a short, Corsican boy who loved maps, who craved control, who feared irrelevance, and who, despite exile, defeat, and wallpaper poisoning, managed to do the impossible. He made being forgotten feel impossible, because while most rulers become trivia, Napoleon became the test question itself. Who crowned himself emperor? Who lost at Waterloo? Who was exiled twice? All roads, somehow, lead back to him. And while some statues crumble, and some scholars move on, Napoleon remains fixed in the great museum of history's most memorable overachievers. Like a monogrammed cannonball, rolling through time, the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, told in exhaustive and deliberate detail, now draws to a gentle close. But rest assured, dear listener, the march is not over. It simply slows. In the end, Napoleon achieved what few mortals manage. He outlived his own life. He exists in documentaries, video games, strategy board games, and even butter commercials. His name appears in textbooks, bar trivia, courtroom arguments about ambition, and jokes about short tempers. Even people who can't spell Corsica can name at least one Napoleon fact, mainstream historical fact. Today, Napoleon's Code, civil, created in 1804, remains the foundation of many modern legal systems, including those in France, Belgium, parts of Canada, and various countries that briefly considered powdered wigs stylish. The actual man, of course, is long gone. His bones rest beneath gilded marble. His hat, or at least a hat, sells at auction for €500,000. And historians, still weary, continue to write about his every decision, including the time he allegedly sneezed during a treaty negotiation and startled an ambassador. Quirky tidbit. Some fans of Napoleon have formed online communities where they roleplay as Bonapartists, debating alternative timelines in which Napoleon wins at Waterloo, conquers London, and introduces mandatory croissants in Parliament. Yes, that's a real thing. Historians still argue whether Napoleon knew the full scale of his legacy, whether he foresaw that school children would mutter his name between yawns, or that sleepy British professors would one day drone his story into microphones for insomniacs on YouTube. But if he did, surely he would have smiled, because what is power, if not control, over how you are remembered? And now, dear listener, you've made it. You've walked the winding, fog-draped roads from Ajaccio to Elba, from artillery cadet to emperor, from exile to myth. And you did it not with the urgency of conquest, but with the serenity of a museum after hours, where the only sound is the soft echo of distant footsteps and a janitor humming near the busts. Napoleon, for all his noise in life, has grown quiet in memory. His wars have ended. His voice has faded. His statues, chipped by wind and time, now sit silently as pigeons land on outstretched bronze fingers. And you, listener, have witnessed it all. Slowly, deliberately, drowsily. In this version of his story, this boring biography, the cannonballs are made of fluff. The horses are gently trotting in place, and every coronation is accompanied by a polite yawn. Sleep is not just welcome here, it's encouraged. So rest now. Let Napoleon's exhausting ambition melt into background hum. Let the maps roll back into tubes. Let the marble tomb fade from your thoughts and drift gently, gently, gently into the quiet, into the forgetfulness that even Napoleon couldn't conquer. Thank you for staying with me. I'm Professor Sleepington, and this was your boring descent into greatness. Good night, sweet dreams.